be go to the next one.
Do you see it now?
Yeah, here we go. Okay, cool. We're
okay,
on.
perfect.
Yes, I do. We are a very small design studio based in Montreal and New York City. I'm here in Brooklyn. Antonio is in Montreal at the moment. And we work with a network of very talented designers around the world. We especially work in UK, Canada, and US. Mostly on service design. We started as a service design agency, and now we are moving towards the idea of workplace strategy and design studio. And that's because we realized that a lot of the work that we do with our clients, mostly in the financial sector and in government, is really redesigning the way they work internally. So on to the next slide. And sorry, guys, if I have to kind of ask Antonio to move the slide. I don't have control on my end. So I'm the Antonio on the left here. I have an industrial design background. And then I went on studying a very interesting multidisciplinary program in London at Central St. Martin called Narrative Environments, which is about using storytelling and narratives and map narratives on spaces. And it's really like, it could be called experience design, but it was really focused on the idea that design also goes across different channels. And the story that you want to tell goes across different channels. That made me really think that industrial design was not enough for me. And there was this kind of experiential layer that I wanted to explore. And so I also landed on the idea of designing together. So participatory design, co-design, and that's how I approach self-design. I then came here to New York, studying social innovation with my PhD at Parsons, and really focusing on placemaking and observing how the work environment was changing. I did the thesis on co-working design, which at the time, 4 years ago, was kind of like a very new field, very hard to really pull it off in academia. But I'm glad I did that, because now that's what we are focusing. We are focusing on the idea of fostering new processes and collaboration, as well as design spaces that really can host them. And I leave Antonio to introduce himself.
Yep. So I guess I'm the other Antonio. I'm originally based in Montreal. In fact, it's where I live and it's where I grew up. But I spent about 5 years or so in Milan, actually where I did my first degree and where I ended up working a lot of my years and developing a lot of my experience in service design and working across different service systems. And always kind of interested in this question around organizations in service design, and particularly around what holds back projects that we are working on. And there were some projects that were working super well and where you would see this huge change happening within. And then there were some projects that would essentially get locked and essentially not move further. And I think those are some of the frustrations that perhaps many people that work within, say, design strategy or strategic design or even service design end up facing. And so I became quite interested on that sort of organizational and work layer. And that's kind of what drew me towards the second master's that I do now. And in a sense, the work that I'm doing now, which is much more geared towards facilitations, but that should be human systems intervention rather than interactions. But essentially a lot of what I'm doing, it's okay. A lot of what I'm doing now is in human systems intervention. In fact, I see one person here that it's in the same master's as me, Leah. It's amazing to see you. And a lot of what that focuses is how do we actually create interventions? How do we create change within what can be considered human systems, within organizations, within groups, within communities, and what's behind that? And so it became something that was really fascinating, and it's really what drew me towards this aspect of not just looking at what service design, how to do service design for people, but essentially, how do we support organizations that are looking to build this capacity inside of it? And more importantly, by understanding how do these organizations, how do these groups, how do these teams actually work? And so much of this talk on governance, and then much of the work that we're doing together with Antonio is really around that question, and the question around how do things work? How do people work? How do we enable better work? And then how do we understand these different characteristics and then bring these understandings to a wider community, a wider design community in this case, in order to support the type of stuff that you're doing, in order to help you create the sort of impact that you're hoping to achieve. And it's kind of me in a really quick nutshell. Cool. let you go until.
Gonna move on. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I mentioned, now that's really like the territory of our work is really something in between space and processes, and try to make them work together. But go to the next one, because I think, you know, like if we kind of look into these two conceptual areas, then you realize that you have so many elements that actually interplay to make really work happen. And so, of course, like on the idea of space, we work on how to strategize to create spaces that really foster collaboration. And then there's the idea of like what tools, you know, people use on the workplace, and how those tools really allow them to collaborate. Also, I mean, now talking about the, you know, multiple channels. I mean, obviously the physical channel, but digital. I mean, even more now. And then there's this idea of facilitation. So, I mean, we're going to talk about design practices, like how to kind of cultivate design practices. You can introduce any design movement within an organization if somehow you don't facilitate that. You know, sometimes the leaders of this movement don't facilitate that. So what are the ways to facilitate design in situation where teams don't really have a professional facilitators every day? So collaboration, and on the other side, like we have, you know, the kind of more intangible areas or aspects of work, which are what are the policy that affect the way you behave on your workplace and you make decisions, and so governance, and then methods and capacity. So capacity, how you, I mean, what do you know about design within your department or your team or your organization? How design is socialized? How can people learn about design constantly to really also adopt the methods that are spread within the organization. So I mean, it's really the kind of the full spectrum of like the space and the processes that enable design within the organization, and these are the different aspects that we really play around every day. So next one. I mean, out of it, obviously, we have certain, let's say, offers or services that are the kind of bread and butter of really what we do. And it's, we do a lot of design innovation and capacity building. We do a lot of work on, you know, user research or employee, user-employee research within our client context, even before suggesting new ways of working or new ways of redesigning services. We do workplace activation, which is the idea of when you want to implement a new design team or a new design group, how do you activate the workplace around it? And obviously, a lot of you know, very important, I think, not very important work, but like kind of new work that we are discussing with clients is the idea of how do we evaluate collaboration, how do we evaluate the impact of design and the impact of design methods that are inherently collaborative. So how do we come up with metrics around that, and how we use those metrics to really inform our the iteration of our design processes. So yeah, that's us. But I want to kind of get a little bit into the topic of the meetup today, and I have a couple of let's say clarification or rules of engagement. So a lot of the stuff that we are kind of about to discuss with you, and really going to be a discussion, it's going to be like a chat, it's going to be as interactive as possible. So all the information and the insights that we're going to share, they come from our projects. They come from work with our clients. So we know that there is a lot of literature out there. There are a lot of academic studies around governance, leadership, and we do read them, and we actually are pretty, you know, we enjoy theory as well. But let's say the kind of angle of this talk is more about, you know, like really kind of drawing from our practical experience. So if we say things that maybe might not make sense for you, and they might kind of disalign with some sort of like theory, you know, I mean, please let us know. I mean, we are really open, and we are in a very generative moment to kind of like develop this idea of governance, like also design governance. So we are kind of like experimenting and kind of asking to a lot of communities, a lot of things around governance. and we're probably gonna build a offer on it. But for now, it's really, we are trying to understand that. So yeah, it's a moment of sense making, and I mean, in a moment, we're gonna do an activity where we're kind of gonna share a little bit what we all know about governance. So if we understand what it is, if we understand what are the parts that make you know, governance something relevant. Anto, do you want one?
Cool. So I can take over. Awesome. So I'll start a little bit because we wanted to start this this talk before we actually start talking about it with a little bit of a space for the different people around this that came here to get to know each other, to connect with each other, but then to also to start to draw on a little bit of our experience and create a bit of a fun activity around what it means to have a design practice and what it means to basically develop a governance structure around that design practice. And so we're going to give you 15 minutes. It's a bit of time. And we're going to put you into breakout rooms of 3 people. And essentially, we're going to give you that space in those 15 minutes to quickly introduce yourselves and your roles. And so what are your professional roles? What do you do? And then based on those 3 roles, to create your own ad hoc design practice. So it's a bit of an activity. It's a bit of a thought activity. So based on your 3 roles, based on what you do, you know, create your own ad hoc design practice. And we're going to sort of go through that. We're going to debrief that a little bit, and hopefully that gives us a little bit of a basis to then go on for the rest of the talk. And so
I would say also use, yeah. I mean,
yeah.
take the word practice as really like really openly, because I mean, we know that it's that it has different meanings and different nuances. So I mean, the purpose of it is really to unpack all those meanings.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to stop share here because it's not showing me the chat. Here we go. So I'm going to put this in the chat, and then I'm going to put you all into these lovely breakout rooms. And you're going to be put automatically into the breakout room, so no need to click a button. Perfect. Great. So I'm going to create breakout rooms. No, so it's not 3 roles for each person. You're going to have 1 role for each person. So what role do you do? What's your professional practice? And with those 3 roles, you try to figure out a design practice that mixes them all together.
So basically, yeah, out of the collaboration of the 3 people in the group, like what could be something that would be your future design practice if you had to work with these people?
Exactly. So I'm just going to move myself out of here. It's really difficult with this many people. Usually I'm used to making breakout rooms with less people, so it becomes easier to set this up.
Yes, Dana has a great explanation of this activity. If we are 3 of you and you meet in a pub and you wanted to start a company or, you know, create something together, what that would be? Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
It's awesome. Cool. So one of you is going to be 4, just in terms of the way the numbers are set up. And then I'm going to open up all rooms, and we're going to start from there. Cool. And I'll be giving you the timing over the broadcast. So 3, 2, 1, opening the rooms now.
Can we start?
Cool. Are we all here? I always have a hard time. Cool. Awesome. Awesome. Okay, we're all here. Good. Cool. So I wanted to take maybe 15 minutes just to debrief that, a little bit of things that came up, and just learn a little bit more about what emerged out of that conversation. And so can we start with someone a brave volunteer who wants to talk a little bit about the design practice that they created in their breakout group. So does anyone want to volunteer? Someone? Yep. Okay, I see Dana with his hand up. Dana?
So I was with Tamora and Beth, and we started out by just talking about what our experience had been. We found all three of us have kind of run design practices before. We come from organizational transformation and a lot of facilitation. And we decided, well, if that was our skills, between the three of us, probably the best practice we could create is one where organizations have talented people who would like to solve a problem in a different way. And our practice would be about coming in and filling the role of like the guide, the Sherpa who leads you up the mountain using design practices. And we talked about some of the things that we would have to do. And like Tamora was saying that we would really need to get people to create like a shared language and kind of get on the same page. And that you'd have to kind of teach people how to share the problem together, and these would be some of our governance things.
Cool.
Yeah. So that was our design practice.
Awesome.
Very cool.
And if I can just probe a little bit further, what were some of the, like, I should say, can you tell me more about how that, so you told me a little bit about where the design practice come from, but can you tell me more about how you came up with that one specifically? And particularly more about why that's a practice for you.
So we really came to it just kind of listening to each other, like what were our strengths and our experiences. And then one of us just kind of suggested, if that's the strengths and the experiences we have, what if we were this kind of practice, right? We kind of just worked around, well, if we had that kind of practice, what would be important? What are some of the kind of things that we would do in order to deliver the value of our practice? And we kind of went from there.
So if I can ask you, how did you make sense of what a design practice is, or did that conversation come up?
So at first we were a little bit confused, like what exactly is this, what was exactly the assignment kind of, what was the deliverable? But I think in my own head, the way I thought about it was, how, if all three of us have design skills, how could we provide value to someone leveraging design? And there could have been a lot of different ways, because we could have gone down we can be a very research oriented, we help you discover insights kind of company. We could have been kind of a very end to end, kind of company. We could have been like one person on our team, Beth, has a lot of experience in financial services. We could have been very niched in that. We could have been a prototyping,
exactly.
Kind of like drive through startup. But looking at our skills, I guess we decided that we could provide value by helping teams experience problem solving through design with someone to guide you, so you didn't get intimidated and pull out and go back to MBA stupidness too quickly.
So what I'm hearing is that it's a combination of understanding what some of the skills were in the room, and then learning about or thinking about, okay, what's the value actually? So that's an interesting thing. What's based on these skills, what's the value proposition? And then what's the actual structure that might enable that value to actually be scaled or to create that impact?
Yeah, very much so. We were kind of looking at three things. What are we good at, right? Yeah. What is something of value that comes out of that? Where's the need within an organization that they would want something out of that? And how many organizations have tried to launch some kind of initiative? They did a 2-day design thinking camp, and they tell their team, come back and innovate for me and revolutionize us.
Yeah.
And then they get into the nitty gritty of it and they get lost. We thought, well, maybe we serve them best by helping them be successful.
Cool. Yeah.
Which is actually interesting, because it's almost like you're helping them to kind of create their own practice, right? Because there's an element of kind of continuity. So the practice is not just, I do that and I kind of like do my workshop one day. That's kind of more like a lecture, really. But like the idea of practice, like there's a continuity to it, a consistency to it, and you have some knowledge that you kind of put in action. So that's very cool.
Cool. Someone else. So we'll take another person. Someone else who's design practice. Thank you for that, Dana. Leah.
Hi. So that was really rich, and I think that we ended up taking like ending up in quite a different place. So I was with Natalie and Yuan, and so Natalie is here. She's hosting, and also works in Capital One. So like internal design practice, and Yuan works in design and music publishing, also in New York, and I work in whole systems change with an emphasis on relational culture in Montreal. And so we sort of were looking at what are we being sensitized to in this moment, and the question of like what could we do together that we couldn't do alone, and talking about, I was on a call earlier today where the host had been working with people from Europe and was like, isn't it so interesting how the European Union they're a union, but yet each country responded so individually to the pandemic. So we were looking at that. We're looking at how the pandemic has amplified fault lines in all parts of our society and humanity. And so looking at mental health issues, which are probably the next big crack, and social inequity and social justice and climate change. And so we were looking at like, in what ways could we use the constraints of the confinement that we're still in a way, in these internal spaces, how these spaces have now become our office spaces. And so how we can manage certain things in a different way where we might not have had control in the office space. What is being magnified right now, internal environments and inner spaces, as well as external environments, and how could we potentially make explicit these fault lines and mobilize in a way that we can start scaffolding our learning and our knowledge, and start responding in an earlier way. Like sort of what are we already learning? Where are we already making mistakes with the pandemic? And what can we be working on right now? That's kind of where we ended up.
Wow. Okay. So so you really went the whole system, like the whole systems.
Yeah. We're like, okay, what are we looking at here?
So I'm going to go one level. It's really cool. I'm going to go one level. How did you make sense of, in a sense, the brief, or how did you make sense of creating your own design practice?
I also want to say, I really hope that I haven't totally bastardized this to my teammates. I'm really great.
You're great. Don't worry.
You know, we were sort of, I think we were trying to make sense of it kind of episodically, like it just came up, it would come up as a question like every couple of minutes, like, okay, and so what does that mean in terms of design practice? Natalie, do you want to say something like, what have I left out?
I wouldn't say you've left anything out. I think for us, we were like the vastness of like, what is your design practice? We went between like, well, what are we doing now versus like, what do we even care about? And I think that like opened up the floodgates of like, these are all the things we could focus on. So we were having almost like an existential conversation. So that's where we took our chat.
That's very cool. I love the idea. Oh, go Anton.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just saying this is super interesting because, I mean, another thing that, I mean, at least me, when I kind of describe our practice, is like not really describing it as a I mean, we are a company now because we're an agency, but like it's not really, that's just kind of like the container. I mean, it doesn't really matter. What we describe is more like how we got to here. So there's this idea of evolution and kind of like experimentation that it's sort of what you guys described. And so like kind of you do things and you do initiatives and you do projects and then kind of you try to sort of synthesize out of this project, then what is your practice? What is that staying with you? What is that you are learning and you can reapply? So there is this idea of like maybe going a little bit in different directions and trying things, and then along the way, sort of like collecting, you know, the result that are kind of your development in terms of knowledge and expertise. And so kind of like as a snowball effect, that's how your practice really kind of builds up.
Yeah.
So yeah,
and I love the
my interpretation of this.
I love the idea of like calling this like an existential crisis, because it is. Like for me, it was definitely an existential crisis, which is like you're really talking about like not just your purpose but your way of being when you get into these things. And so it's an interesting way of looking at it. And I also love the two examples because I think they both exhibit, I think, two aspects of the practice of what I've seen in design practices, which is like a response to this crazy ambiguity of trying to sense and make sense of what's happening around us. And then on the other side, a way to leverage working together better, and a way of getting people that we want to work with, or people that we think that have different skills, and finding a way to get them to collaborate together. And I think both these things are aspects that we're going to explore now. And I want, obviously we won't be able to go through everyone's design practice, but I really encourage everyone to really kind of reflect on the conversations that came up in their breakout groups as we sort of go through this presentation, and sort of make sense of this together through our lens. And then we'll create a second activity in the same breakout groups. Well, we'll make sense of it more collectively. So I'll share my screen. I don't know if you want to add something, Anto, before we move to the next part.
No, I think we have more things maybe in the next slides.
Cool. So can everyone see that? Everyone sees that? Okay, cool. Awesome. Go.
Yeah. So I think those examples of design practices, they were very cool. And I think that's how we describe our practice, for example. And of course, then and as you kind of start structuring and start kind of working together with a group of people for a longer period of time, you kind of give yourself some constraints, and that's just ours. It looks like a process actually, but that's how I would define our practice, because we always do the research, and then like this moment of testing and temporary environment is something that is really important to us, which actually goes a little bit sometimes in contrast with the idea of how kind of linear design thinking can be, and really kind of spend a lot of time testing and working together with people, and really kind of let behavior and group dynamics emerge. So this moment of really kind of waiting and taking like really a moment for people to really understand how design feels to them, it's something that maybe characterize our practice, and then we kind of just scale up some kind of solution, some kind of methods that work for the team we work with. So those are some of the characteristics of our practice, and this slide is just to see that obviously as things evolve, then it's a good idea to start visualizing and kind of structuring your practice a little bit, especially if then as a creative or design professional you want to sort of offer that to the external world.
Yeah, and I'd like to add like even in terms of, and I'm only adding it now because I realize it now, but like the way we introduced ourselves in terms of our own backgrounds and how we came into this individually became the foundations for what defined our own design practice, and what shows up on the screen as sort of our approach and the things that we do on a regular basis. So I thought it was kind of an interesting link.
Yeah. But the one thing that, just to kind of like move on a little bit and kind of like land on this idea of design governance, we ask ourselves, why do we need to speak about design governance? Why is it relevant? Which kind of in a more complex form is this question of why do you need to situate your design practice within a wider construct, the wider construct being the design governance. That's because what we encountered in our projects is that design is essentially the field of ambiguity, at least for me. The job of you as a designer is really to help your client, or even sometimes help yourself to navigate that ambiguity, to bring some clarity, to synthesize rich information and data points that you discover, and then kind of to design some artifact out of it that makes sense and kind of like help the user to navigate the complexity of that given situation they need to navigate. And so, in order to do all that, that's just not how, if you take all that and you kind of bring that design practice at large in an organization, that's not an organization works, right? Organizations tend to be a little bit more rational. Management tends to be a little bit more linear in the way they work. They really seek predictability. And that's just not how design works. So you have a little bit of a not contradiction, but contrast tensions there. And so in order for this tension to really work and be productive, you need like a governance. You need like a way to make decision based on how design work, which is not how you make decision in an organization, in general. And so that's how we kind of landed to this idea of design governance. There was really an emerging need of pretty much all our projects. And so how do you decide around design, and how do you carry yourself? Really, like, how do you kind of address any challenge that you meet within your project, especially kind of like in conversation with leadership, I would say. And so, I mean, some of the tensions that are really kind of specific to design practices are the idea that, you know that there are some more topics in the market. I mean, at the moment, maybe, UX, artificial intelligence, but then you also kind of, as a creative person, have like a personal development path. You have some sort of like a personal, most of us have like some personal research at any level and kind of we explore different things. And so, I mean, this contrast is sometimes something that it's hard to navigate for a design professional. I mean, if we had to go for what made more sense as a design team, we wouldn't probably do service design because, I mean, service design 5 years ago, 7 years ago when we started, it was super niche and it was really hard to sell. It was just kind of a very complicated. There were not many books around. I mean, it was kind of like in a situation that was very germinal. And I think it was super fascinating, but we just kind of understood that it was what made sense for us. And we, kind of started, going deep in that. So that's kind of one tension. And then next one, Anto. Oh yeah, I mean, an example of that is, I love this example because it's from a, great designer I know. She's called Georgia Lupi. She's an information designer. She works at Pentagon. Probably most of you know her. And at one point, when Cuomo started, giving all this presentation about COVID with all the kind of actually pretty popular slides, she said, okay, I don't have to do that, but I really feel that these slides, all this information might use some infographic support. And so kind of she started this, this website where you can find all this information that you kind of find also, from other sources, but they are organized, by her, by very successful information designer. And so they're very accessible. And so, I mean, they kind of deliver value to the community in that sense. And it's something that kind of she did for her own, I guess, passion and kind of willingness to help. So that's kind of an example of how sometimes what makes more sense for you as a professional opportunity is not necessarily what you are supposed to do or what you want to do in the moment, because maybe you need to kind of like really focus on what's your more general instinct, let's say. Next one. And then another thing that we're really reflecting as a characteristic of a design practice within an organization is the fact that a client give you a to-do list, and I mean, it's actually not true in the sense it's metaphorical. I mean, we never got a to-do list and with the project, but I mean, somehow you kind of like scope the project with your client, and you have a book of work, or you have like a timeline, a project plan. I mean, it's pretty structured most of the time. The larger is the organization, the more structured it is. When we work with government, we literally need to kind of tell them everything in advance. That's what we're gonna do on each month, and that's what we're gonna do after research, and that's how we're gonna use research, blah blah, and that's great. But again, you kind of see emerging this tension between rational organization and design practices, because most of the time you discover things during your research that really call for a different path of actions and activities. So you just discover something that you couldn't know before, and then you need to pivot. That's an example of that. Anthony, you want to talk about that? You were more involved in this project.
Yeah, sure. So in this case, we were working with, I was working with a hospital, and I think it was 2014, 2015. And it was a really unique case because it was an emergency department that was looking to redesign the entire emergency department and wanted to leverage service design as a methodology in order to support the understanding of needs and then also support the development of that. And I think what was interesting about it is that they had a particular kind of, not necessarily a fixed mindset, but they had a very concrete idea of what they wanted in that development, in terms of an open space. But essentially it was really through our interactions that we were able to make sense of it. We were able to leverage and bring in ideas from the outside world into the space. We were able to leverage co-design in order to sort of give them a different perspective. And I thought it was a really interesting thing because the tension was always kind of around us as a core design team supporting them and facilitating their process, but then also coming in with our own ideas, coming in with a bit of our own perspectives, coming in with our own resources. A lot of them were managers and nurses that basically weren't, that didn't do this on a full-time basis. And so they were also time starved. And so it was really kind of an interesting tension because when it broke through, in a sense that when they kind of looked at the different possibilities, it really opened up and allowed for a completely different way of working. And so what you see on the other side, when you see on the left is really this sort of early stage prototype of what you see on the right, really done with Post-its. But part of that conversation leveraged a much wider conversation with the entire department that then led to the prototyping and the eventual implementation of an open space and a completely new way of working within the emergency department. And so it really kind of leveraged a bit of that tension between the individual or a small group of designers working within a larger team and then supporting them through that shift, through that ambiguity, to then be able to leverage the capacities of the entire organization to then create and enact change.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then, I mean, out of these tensions, we just kind of started, really try to think about, what is it like, I mean, basically the exercise that you sort of like did before, like what's the design process and what are the elements that adapt to what it is a design process and how you cultivate them. And we kind of like saw a very clear distinction between all the making aspects of really the craft, really what you do. If you're a graphic designer, what you do, you really kind of like create visual. That's kind of like your craft. But then obviously as a graphic designer, you need to, market yourself. You need to kind of find clients and you need to kind of like build some sort of relationship to let the client understand what is the value that you can bring in. And so that's kind of the strategic part. And I think those two kind of, main focuses are really key to grow your design practice. And doesn't matter if it's your individual design practice or it's you as a freelance designer, independent designer, or you want to kind of build a design group, design studio, design agency, or even like a big design department within an organization. Those two elements are always true. Like even within an organization, obviously you have like a design team that is there for a specific reason. Maybe it's a UX design team, maybe it's a service design team. But then like there is a way for that team to really interact and build relationship with the organization to really kind of understand where to work and how to work with other pieces of the organization. And so one of the big pieces obviously is making decision, which is the governance part that we're gonna talk in a second. And that's another big part is speaking the language of your context, right? Like, we actually do collaborate with, recently we collaborated with a copywriter, with a graphic designer, and both great experiences. They helped us massively. But even designer to designer, sometimes it's just kind of hard to, speak the same language because it's just kind of like two areas of design that are different and they use different terms. And so in order to kind of really grow your practice, you need to kind of learn all this kind of soft skill as well. And so in a way, it's like situating your design practice with a container. And of course, it can just be you doing design, but we see the idea of design practice as you doing design and having some sort of like constraint around you, which is how you operate with other people, how you brand yourself, like from a kind of storytelling point of view, not from like a strictly visual point of view. And so kind of building these constraints, or like how you learn. Do you have kind of some, kind of recurring practices or kind of, preferred way of learning and updating your knowledge. All these things really kind of into play to kind of building this container, which is your design practice. So that's how we see it. So in response to that, so I mean, governance, we see governance as a response to the idea of cultivating and managing this container, which is your design practice. And obviously, like having a governance around that allows to increase its impact, increase the impact that you bring to organization, the value that you deliver, and also to kind of like really adapt to different system and context, which is ultimately what you need to do when you wanna deliver your design, and you wanna kind of design within any given context. And obviously, I mean, the more the scale of the organization of the system or the context or the community you work with increase, the more you feel the need of this governance. You need to feel how to understand, how do we decide, how do we even understand where the results of this given project gonna end up, how the results of our design gonna be used. Next.
So maybe I can speak to this one if you want, or go.
Yeah, go. Yeah.
Cool. So it's I think the big challenge I had, and I think it's a challenge that we had together, is I think we intuitively understood that this word governance had some resonance and had some possibility to support people that are doing this type of work, but it's also not exactly the most intuitive word to understand what that means. I think we all come from it from different angles. And so the way that we make sense of it is a little bit on a definition level. It's this idea of what's the system that you're setting up to make and implement the decisions that you're doing in order to pursue your objectives. And I really like the etymology of it that actually comes from Old Latin, which is sort of governance is really kind of the steer. It's what allows you to move forward, what gives you that possibility to sort of steer the ship that you're building together, in a sense. And so there's these three questions that for me, governance can be this ambiguous thing. There's these three questions that come from an author, scholar, activist. Her name is Starhawk, and I found this was really useful for me to make sense of governance, which is, where do people have autonomy? Where do you need group agreement, consensus, and who makes decisions about what? And this is also where governance can embed aspects of social justice as well. And I think many people that are looking at the sort of work and doing a lot of the self-reflective work within their own organizations are asking questions around, or sort of asking themselves questions around these three questions. But whenever you look at your own design practices, whenever you look at your interactions with a client at a micro scale, or you're looking at your own design practices on a macro scale, let's say if you actually have, I'm thinking about Capital One, but Capital One and how they do design, a lot of the times you're having this tension between these three questions, which is around autonomy, which is around where do you actually need the consensus and agreement from a group, and who makes these decisions, and essentially where are these decisions made. And that sort of sets up either the overt governance structure, which is a governance structure that you know about and that you can say, okay, that's how it works, or the implicit and covert governance structure that oftentimes can end up becoming what you're working under without sometimes realizing it. I don't know if you want to add something, Anto.
No, I mean, I think no on this one. But I mean, I think I want to iterate the idea that there is a governance structure no matter what. Maybe this diagram actually explains it a little bit. I mean, you doesn't matter. So I mean, the idea of maybe intentional governance is the key one, because what we also found in our experience is that, I mean, there's gonna be someone making decision. There's gonna be a degree of autonomy that you have or not as a team or as a designer. So I mean, maybe like the best option is to try to kind of be intentional about that and try to kind of design those interactions that you have with your stakeholders, rather than just kind of let them go. Because I mean, most likely they're gonna create some tension along the way. So yeah, maybe the only thing I want to add is that, and I'm just kind of like, brainstorming now, actually, just think about that now, that maybe like it doesn't exist a system where there is no governance. It's just a system where there's awareness of governance, but like there's a governance no matter what.
Yeah.
And I mean, just to kind of like also like then, you know, make some sense also of the distinction making and strategy. I mean, the way you can see, you know, where this layer of decision making and governance is really around those two smaller areas, which is the making part. So like, you know, we do user research, we do UX, we do UI, we do service design. I mean, we actually do this thing. And then generally around this layer, there is an idea of like, okay, this is how service design is done, you know, across the organization. So there's like some methodology that maybe, I mean, most likely are developed in advance, and they're kind of like then adopted over time. And then around those methodology, the methodology is generally like the strategic part. I mean, it's a little bit of the strategic part because obviously depending on what tools and methods you use, I mean, basically you contextualize design within within the environment of your organization. But then around that, there is this idea of governance, because I mean, even like with a given methodology that it's really, you know, let's say kind of like developed for your context, you always had the problem of like, okay, how do we use this methodology to sort of reach our strategic goal? And so, I mean, these are the kind of three layers. And yeah, I think I just stop on that on this one. Maybe, yeah, I'll just stop on this. What we have next? So, I mean, but we have examples of those, right? Because actually, like, we were thinking and reflecting recently on how do we work as a collective, so as this community of this meetup, and how do we work in relationship to service and network. And we had a lot of like, you know, thinking about that. We always try to improve what we can, you know, do for the network, and kind of like try to understand how the network can support local chapters at a local level. And so then we realized with Antonio, when we kind of put together this presentation, that actually a network is a governance model. So it's just kind of like, you know, there's a central, in this case, there's a central group that kind of like came out with some programs, some educational programs, the conference, the Touchpoint magazine, and then the idea of the local chapters. And then they kind of, you know, leave autonomy to the local chapters to work with their local community. And then, and I mean, obviously the local community, like maybe join the conference or kind of make use of the resources that the central network work on. And so, I mean, it's a system, you know, it's like a flow, it's a governance model. But then like, so that's one. Another example is the studio model, which is essentially like how a design agency works. But it's very interesting because we saw in most big organizations that even if they have in-house teams, they still operate with a studio model. Essentially. So, I mean, a lot of teams in a lot of organizations, also our clients, they sort of act as internal lab or literally internal agencies, and they sort of need to negotiate and win projects and kind of just justify their existence. I mean, that's kind of the term that I always use. Maybe it's a bit strong, but it depends how frustrated they are. But like some you know, some clients that are also friends, I mean, they say, yeah, we really need to constantly justify our existence and make sure that we're gonna keep existing. Literally, like as your organization is your market, but it's just kind of a closed market. Like an agency needs to kind of survive in the industry, in their market. And so, I mean, you know, so you start seeing that, yes, there is like a kind of like more spontaneous governance model for also in-house teams, but maybe it's not the ideal one, right? Because I mean, if you have something that is internal, you don't want to question their existence. You don't want this kind of piece of your body to have to kind of adapt and fight for surviving. You want that to naturally kind of grow and be in there and really cultivate that.
Actually, Anto, can I take maybe a few minutes?
I was actually leaving you the floor.
No, and I really
yes,
wanted
I was leaving you the.
Cool. I wanted to check in with all of you to see, well, one, is this resonating? Are you understanding this? Is this kind of like going, are we going in a completely different direction? And two, like, are you thinking about what other governance models come up for you when when we're presenting this? Are there other governance models for you that are kind of coming up? And we'll have a bit of an activity where we'll go more in depth in that, but I wanted to check in to see, these are two examples that we came up with, but are there other ones that are kind of coming up for you now that we're presenting it?
I'll jump in here. My name is Pauline.
Hi,
and
Pauline.
I think I'm looking to hear more about the business value of design and more about OKRs and metrics and KPIs and how you measure those as compared to like the work that you're actually doing as a studio agency. So yeah, I think I'm more interested in hearing like how you measure like what you do.
Okay, cool. So what I'll do is I'll park that on the side because we're going to have a Q&A session after this. We'll be able to answer questions like that. But in terms of like right now, are there any like governance models or ways that like people are, or even it could be situations that they're finding themselves in or working in that are coming up for them, like examples that they know of?
There's a comment from Emily in the chat too.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, she's saying, I think an example of where there wasn't a clear governance structure in place, which led to tension, conflict, and decision paralysis. Yeah, so it seems that the people are also, Emily, thank you for adding a comment. Yeah, structure described as flat. So yeah, flat structure, and then sort of kind of like unclear governance, which can be as extreme as paralyzing decision making.
Yeah. Dana, I saw your hand up as well.
I was going to say, I don't know, maybe it's the same thing, it's just a studio model. But when you have like a small practice inside of a larger company. So Fjord is inside of Accenture. It's almost like an internal consultant. It lives somewhat independently. I don't know if that has a separate name or not. And, there would be kind of additional challenges there. How do you stay tightly ingrained with the business of the big company so that you're at the table for the discussions about opportunities while still being able to work differently from the rest of the organization and slowly infect them?
Yeah. The hope. So I think that's very interesting. First of all, because it's a very common scenario right now. Like, we have like a lot of agencies acquired by bigger groups. And I think, it is, it's not really like, it's similar to kind of studio model thing, but actually there is another layer of complexity there, because you acquire, a group like the agency that might have a more or less deliberate model and kind of like a organizational culture, and then you kind of like have this clash of this kind of group that is already working together, and actually generally very successful agencies. That's why they are acquired, and then the wider group that has some expectation over the smaller group, and so there's a lot of complexity there, and legacy systems as well. I kind of find something else.
Are there any other governance models that are coming to mind?
I think another interesting comment was about organization that might have a particular governance structure. So the governance structure is defined, but then the operational model, or the operation of the organization actually don't fit in the governance model. So basically it's like a contract, like, so that's actually a good point. This is Leah, thank you for that. Because that's actually a very designerly point. Like, you can design that, but then if you kind of don't test those interactions or those decision-making processes, you might just kind of like top down land on a governance model that don't make sense for then what needs to be decided.
Well, it's on paper but not in practice type of thing.
Right.
And you all have a couple comments in the chat as well. I see Tim came a little bit late and had a comment, and then Emily also had a comment too.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, Emily, a lot of design teams like a flat structure in the spirit of collaboration, but decision by consensus often doesn't work. Yeah, and that's actually, yeah, thank you, Emily. That's super interesting as well, because yeah, you have a clash between, let's say, kind of the methods that are inherently collaborative, and the fact that maybe in practice they don't work. And so, I mean, also this idea of reaching consensus, even when it works, then is it like really what you're looking for in terms of disruption of the ideas, in terms of innovation of the ideas? And so then now you're kind of like questioning how the governance model really has the power of enabling design versus constraining the power, the value of design. So that kind of make me think maybe kind of methodology. I mean, the diagram that we saw, kind of making, methodology, and governance. Maybe methodology really needs to kind of, be involved in governance. Yeah.
And also, one of the things that helped me understand more about consensus actually comes from Starhawk as well. And one of the things she says is that consensus is really about a thinking process. It's a process that prioritizes thinking and leveraging all the thinking that's in the room versus going straight to a decision. And so it's kind of like, what are you trying to achieve type of thing with each of these?
Yeah, and then there are some other comments, I mean, different people, but like kind of around the idea of like, how do you actually start that, right? How do you start? Like, if there is no governance, or at least like there's no deliberate governance model, how do you start one? And I mean, I would respond to that, because I mean, we had kind of like very recent experience with a very big bank here in US. I mean, we were tasked to also build a governance model, which we started actually. I mean, we were tasked with starting it, really, not really kind of completing it. But the idea was to sort of start having this type of conversation that we're having today with the leadership of this organization, like making them aware that design had some very specific needs. I mean, you can kind of like acquire design by buying an agency or hiring people, but then you still kind of need to create what I call the territory for design to deliver their value. And so by having this conversation, you start kind of like talking about, okay, how can we start this? How can we start kind of cultivating this territory? And then you kind of, next step is getting a bit more practical, which is, okay, let's prototype maybe a meeting where monthly we decide based on the result that the design teams show us, how to take a decision around that. So it's really like a prototyping process. And I mean, you have different ways to do that. You have like kind of, groups, councils, you have the board, you have different kind of bodies and kind of touch points that kind of, are part of what the governance system is.
But Anto, I think I would move on now. We have a bit of space for Q&A at the end. And so the questions are moving into Q&A territory. So I would just move on to get to the last couple of points. Yes.
Yes.
Cool.
Yes.
So I'm going to move us to this slide, and then 1 second. Let me see. Cool. All right. Go for it, Anto.
Oh yeah, I think, I mean, actually we can go quite fast here, because I mean, that's something we discussed already. Like, if you kind of map the relationship between really the making layer of design and the methodology that really guide you through what to do at any given moment of the process, and then kind of like a governance layer around that allows you to make decisions and provide autonomy to the people that are doing the design. Then if you have this kind of like construct, then you understand that the sort of like there's like a bottom-up, top-down hybrid dynamic where the making and the methodology kind of feed the governance. I mean, it's actually a little bit what we're saying, like, that methodology needs to work with governance, because the governance is to actually allow you to make decision on what are the methods that you apply, right? So I mean, you know, the design team can kind of like discover things, do research, prototype things, and all these inputs are data point for leaders to really understand how to manage design within their organization. And then on the other end, you know, like governance of top down, they need to, you know, kind of provide the right space, give permission to do things, connect people, connect pieces of the organization. So that's just to say that it would be hard for the design team to advocate for a governance around design, but at the same time, leadership by themselves, they can, you know, package the governance for you and deliver that to you as a design team for using it for kind of like orienting yourself. It needs to work both ways.
Cool. So I guess we can move on to just a second small activity. So that second activity is going to be quicker than the first one. We're just going to take 10 minutes together. And what I'm going to invite you to do is in the same breakout groups. And so I'm going to put you in the breakout groups of 3 that you were previously in. And so you're going to be able to draw on that experience and maybe have a bit more time to connect or go deeper with the people you met with. I'm going to share a link to a mural board. And the mural board, if you've never used it before, it's going to be pretty simple. It's going to essentially have 2 levels, 2 sides to it. And essentially it's going to ask you, I'm going to be asking you two key questions. Sorry, I'm just going to go here. Well, the first question is, collectively, what do you think are the parts of governance? In a sense, what are the different elements that make up a governance structure for you, or things that you've noticed in your past experience, or even drawing on the design practice that you developed? And the second question is, how do we learn more about governance? How do we explore this topic further? How do we have conversations about this topic? How do we make it more collectively part of a conversation that we have within our organizations? And I do look at this differently than just deciding what our organizational structure is. I think there is an aspect around decision making and who makes decisions that is an important part of governance, an important part of supporting the design practice that we're looking to develop. And so you're going to have those 2 questions. So what are the different parts of governance and how do we explore them further? And essentially, I'm going to be sharing a link to a mural board. And it's going to be really simple. I'm going to be asking you to put your answers into that mural board. For you, some of you that haven't used mural, it's just a collective whiteboard. And so you're going to just be able to double click on the white area, and a post-it will come up when you double click on that. And you'll be able to put your answers. And so you can answer that question: what are the different parts of governance and how do we explore them further? And we'll give you about 10 minutes to do that. Are there any questions before we start off? Cool. So I'm going to go back to our breakout rooms. I'm noticing there's some shifts in the breakout rooms with different people coming in and out. So I'm going to be moving around some people just to make sure that we're back to groups of 3s. No one's left alone. Make sure that we're all good here. Cool. Awesome. And I think I also have to make one small change. Cool. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. You should be with people that you've been in the past. Some of you might be with completely new people, but that might be just because of the way that the room shifted. And then the 2 questions, I think I put them in the chat. I'll put the instructions in the chat fully. So in the same breakouts group of 10, define governance on 2 levels. What are the parts of governance and how do we explore them further? So I'm going to open up the rooms. We'll have 10 minutes together.
Thank you. Hi.
I just want to clarify that I know these people. I just don't make comment of people with glasses randomly.
He's fine. He does all the time.
I just don't pick on people fashion. That would be bad. Okay, I think we're all back, Anton. We can go because we don't have much time. Are you on mute? Yes, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Of course.
Yes.
Cool. So I just wanted to share the mural, and it looks like you had hopefully you had a generative conversation. It looks really generative from what I see on the mural right now. But really just quickly going through some of the things that I'm seeing, and then essentially we'll have maybe a bit of time to talk about it at the end, zoom in on some of this stuff. But what are the different parts of governance? I'm seeing a shared language, creating team alignment, defining a service cycle, understanding what meeting cadence is. So when are you meeting? That's really interesting. Yeah, looking at like even the idea of epics and stories as part of a wider governance model, looking at agile. That's like a different way of looking at it, which is cool. I didn't even think of that. Checkout, understanding of strategy, project charters. Looking resiliency, how silos can work together, how decisions are made, tenets and principles. I think that's a really interesting one. Workspace policies, establishing the processes, accountability measures, decision-making, definitions of success. So these are really interesting because we're going to talk about it a bit, really kind of with our wrap up, some of the things that Anto is going to present, but these are all things that can be prototyped and tested. If you look at it through the design lens or how you design governance, these are all elements that you can find ways of testing it, developing a prototype and testing it. So it's really exciting, and hopefully this becomes a shared resource. We're definitely going to share it as well as part of our mural, a shared resource for you. I'm realizing we didn't answer the second question. How do we explore it further? And I'm seeing that as well, like getting a lot of trial and error, researching and seeing where people are at, creating a kickoff and explaining the tenets of governance, socializing it, making it explicit, transparent. I think there's a lot that can be happened from there, because when you make something explicit, transparent, you can start to really easily see when you're not living up to your values or what you have on paper. Flexibility, having types of metrics. So this is really cool because I think it aligns with some of the stuff that we're going to close with, and we'll have space to talk about it a bit later. But this is really awesome. Thank you for this. It definitely gives me new food for thought.
And just so you know, thank you for the comment about the screen share was just a white bar again. So if you're doing more of a presentation, you might want to do a check.
I mean, we saw the mural and then it went on the white bar.
Yeah, no, I know what happened. It's because I'm sharing I have dual screen, and when I take something that I'm sharing on one screen, it doesn't follow it. So that was my bad. I'm sorry about that.
Should we move to should we move to final reflection, question answer? Yeah. Because I mean, the last two slides are really like synthesis of things that we discussed also in the question. So I feel maybe we will share them on the presentation with everybody after the event. Good. But yeah, I think it's a better investment to just
no problem.
Move to question answer.
I'm gonna share.
I just want to say, like, why people come up with questions. I think, I mean, out of the mural board, a very interesting thing that I noticed is this idea of epics, narratives. I mean, I think I want to just pick up on that because, like in this kind of diagram of design feeding leadership to come up with a governance structure and model, is this point of how do you even communicate design? How do you kind of tell the story? And so it's really it really kind of stress test all the artifacts that we have as designer. You can't really discuss a massive journey map with leadership to have them deciding on how design is supposed to work. I mean, it's just kind of too analytic for them to really understand what the value of design is. They can kind of feel and experience that, but you need a new form of communication with your stakeholders. And I think that's kind of one of the struggle of rediscussing governance. How do you communicate those design? I mean, you can create case studies or narrative or stories, but I mean, I think we need to come up with more engaging way, more kind of a synthetic way. Also, those people in leadership, executives, are generally, I mean, they didn't have a lot of time generally. So it's really this question of how you start communicating design. And I mean, I'm just kind of opening here this thing as a question because I don't have an answer. We don't have a tool yet for that. I don't know if it's a tool. The response was just kind of I said the principles. But yeah, I just want to say that I think out of all the mural reflection, this is something that I see as a pattern.
Cool. Do you see that, Anto?
Oh, I think we're gonna move to question and answer because we don't have time.
Oh, you don't want to talk about this? Okay.
Yeah. Yes. No. It's not that I want to talk. I think we should just kind of take questions now.
Okay. Well,
we share all the presentation anyway.
Yeah.
So let's see if there are questions on the chat, or if you want to mute yourself and ask. And it doesn't have to be on governance, or like just kind of also generally topics that are related to everything we said.
I can bring back something that got brought up before, but I don't see her. I think she might have left, Pauline, around sort of the role that OKRs play, or like design metrics, or like wider organizational metrics or business models play within governance. I think that could be something interesting to talk about.
Someone's asking, can you talk about the sharing principles before methods?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. First principle, yeah. So yeah, there was something. Yeah, okay. So I start with that, and then maybe we kind of go on the metric topic. So yeah. So I mean, I think, and that's more related to, I think,
just gonna share my screen.
Running your design practice, or yeah, kind of like growing your design practice in general, not with governance per se, but. I mean, this idea of depth, I think, was very important to us. I mean, in this slide, I really kind of summarized things that are very important to us as a studio, and that really allowed us or helped us. I mean, we didn't grow massively, but I mean, we were like, yeah, I mean, we kind of like growing in terms of doing projects that are always much bigger than us. And so I think one thing that really helped communicating with your clients and build relationship is the fact that you don't communicate methods, but you communicate first principles. And so an example of that is when we do any type of mapping exercise, we don't share, explain, or adopt a journey map, but we share, explain, or adopt what a map is in general. What are the kind of characteristic of a map in general? I mean, you have like some nodes, you have like a network system, you have things that relate to each other, you have different layers of zooming in and zooming out. So I mean, all those principles are first principles. They are not something that are specific to a journey map used in design. They're just, things that are specific to maps in general. And so I think, when you step back and you kind of see your methods and where your methods come from and what are the principles that underlie your methods, then at that point you can create your methods. You don't need to adopt that template. If it doesn't make sense, you can create your own template. And that's, I mean, generally the people you work for, they have different background, and they might understand those more general principles from their point of view, rather than you kind of bringing in a specific method that is kind of maybe done for designers. So yeah, that's kind of one of the things that really help us to communicate and build relationship based on our approaches. Yeah, Anto, do you want to kind of then start talk about the magic thing, which is a very slippery slope subject?
Oh, the OKRs?
Yeah.
Well, it came up as a question, and I thought it was a fair question to speak to. Just because in my view, the idea of a business model or OKRs for designers within a governance model, it's really something that it fits within perhaps governance models. Like it's something that can support them or drive them forward. So, understanding, what business value design has can be directly impacted by the sort of governance model that you have that supports around it, right? And so if you're developing a business model around design that's sort of based on very direct value. So I'm a studio, I'm a design practice within a larger organization, and I'm going to do X amount of work, then that's a sort of business model. And in some ways, in some examples, you have design studios that are actually, selling their services. And so they have to have a certain amount of revenue built in. In other cases, they're just given a base amount of revenue, and then they do the work that they do. And it's not so much, their impact isn't so much measured. So it is to say, it's difficult to give an answer to, what kind of OKRs or what kind of design metrics, business metrics need to be attached to design. I think there's a lot of stuff that talks about this, but it is actually part of, I think, governance is that part of governance is understanding, how are you actually setting yourself up to deliver your value, so that then that makes sense on what kind of metrics or what kind of OKRs you need to align with. That's kind of always how I've seen it. I kind of see it as a separate thing, but that's connected in a sense.
Yeah, and I think, the struggle there is, and the very difficult conversation that you need to have is the idea that you can derive some metrics, meaning you can derive some numbers from measuring your service experience. But then what you are really measuring are the outcome of that experience. So like, is a client satisfied of that interaction? Yes, no. But yes, no, like then you can count yes and you can count the no's. But what you really want to measure is how they are satisfied and why. And so, I mean, you need to kind of run this double thing, like the kind of measure, keep track of the outcome, which is more qualitative, and then you can kind of use a proxy metric counting them. But then actually, like, yeah, but then you have to have this conversation with leadership to really communicate about that. The metrics are just the start of how we understand. Like the metrics are, in a sense, just signal. And then you look into that and you understand the why, which is what design is supposed to do. Yeah, I think I stop there. There's more, but yeah, I'll stop here.
Any other questions?
Three things to help start a practice of design organization that is not design.
That's
design
okay.
or design oriented. Yeah, Dana, thank you. So so there's one premise, which is okay, like if you take the metaphor of the example of school, like you don't gonna learn if you don't want to learn. Like design is not something that you do if you don't want to do it. So I think the first conversation to have is if they are looking for it, and if so, why? Okay, so that's really the first step. Because I mean, there are also organizations, and we had this experience, and they weren't. I mean, we had a couple of experiences that weren't the best client interaction we had, and the reason was always that they either didn't want design, or they wanted design because they heard that design will bring value to their organization, but no understanding really the mechanic and the dynamics of it. They were just kind of trying to acquire design almost like as a product. Like you bring this thing in and he does his job and then he has an outcome. So I think that would be the first conversation. It's not a technique, it's not a method. It's just really like talking openly. And yeah, that would be the first thing I would say. Do you have another one? Because he's asking for 2 or 3. So
yeah.
it's just.
I think to start a practice of design.
Yeah, after that for change. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think it's also developing. I think there's a part of it which is a reflection on your place within the wider organization. Because, a lot of the times I think the mistakes I see a lot of design practices or people that want to start design practices within organizations is that they don't necessarily meet they don't actually necessarily start where the organization is at. They start with where they want the organization to be already. And that creates an inherent tension in the way that you're looking to develop a practice, because you're starting and then you're like, well, they don't understand this. There's a work here. And so starting where the organization is at and where the organization does, how it works, what their sort of quote unquote culture is, sort of helps you understand what are the different steps that you need to take in order to build out. And it is perhaps a question of experiments and prototypes. And so, if an organization tends to be quite rigid, quite focused on similar to what Antonio was saying, focused on predictability, so focused on certainty. Well, then, maybe the first step you're going to do is test out this cool little interesting design practice thing in a very small scale, even a 1 hour, 2 hour meeting. And so you're building it out from there, and you're figuring out, and you're getting a pulse on how does the organization respond to this. So you're doing a probe, you're looking at what's coming back to you, and then based on what's coming back to you, you're going to discern if you can maybe push it a little bit farther. And this is building
on a special project or something like that.
Exactly, and and this is kind of building on a lot of the stuff that people talk about, which is selling the value of design, selling where other firms are doing design. I think all this is important, are important bases, but you don't want to get stuck on the idea of already sort of developing a whole design practice. You want to understand what's a way that you can test how this organization responds to design, and then from that scale it out slowly but surely.
There's also the idea of, like the other thing that we said about like, speaking their language, because I mean, like there's actually a pretty strong narrative in design, in service design, especially here in the US, that, there's this kind of like shift from, web design, the dot-com economy, visual graphic design, that then kind of like slowly evolving to UX. And then now UX is slowly evolving into service design. Why? I mean, because that's what the organization could understand, and they could make the connection between web design and UX, for instance. Then, I mean, now it's fairly easy within, organizations here to talk about service design because you can connect them with UX. It's actually different in Europe because service design comes from different places. So, just kind of start with the practice that you can. I mean, UX obviously for, most organizations, that mainly digital is the way to go. And then from there you evolve and you can do organizational design, you can service design. I mean, you can kind of like shape really the step 2 of the design practice.
Yeah. And I'll add I'll add a number 3 actually, because I realized we're only at 2. I'm looking at your chat, Dana. So I'll add one specification on one thing you put in the chat, which is be a ninja. And I would say, so part of it could be a ninja, but I would say it's almost more beneficial to look at yourself as a detective and not a ninja. Like to be very curious around what's happening within the organization versus looking at yourself as someone that's like going in and throwing a ninja star and hoping you land, And so you really want to be a detective. You want to develop a strong curiosity, and you want to sort of not necessarily crack the case, but you want to understand, what it is that would make this, that would draw this connection. And then number 3, I would say is,
sorry.
Go.
No, I think that you can be open about that. You can be the ninja. You can be like the archaeologist, I call it. And then you can kind of like, flip back that stuff that you discovered to them and have a discussion about that. So you kind of like be sneaky, but then you kind of like offer back your discoveries. And then there's another question I think is pretty interesting about workspace requirement in 2000.
Hold on one second. I'm just going to do
from next year beyond from Barry.
And so I'm just going to do number 3 and then get to this really quickly. I'm just going to say the third one I would say is find your champions. So if you're going to be a catalyst for this, who are your champions that you can leverage, and be very strategic about that. So it's like we often have leadership and it's like this very sort of anonymous, like, you're thinking about people on the board and everyone has a suit, but there are specific people that might really champion your thing and champion your practice that you don't even know about. And so by figuring out, creating the spaces in which you can have conversations like this and finding who your champions are, and ideally champions in higher levels of the organization, I think that also supports you and opens up doors. That's it for number 3. Go.
Yeah. So, I mean, there is this team of, design requirements of office spaces. And I think it seems actually far from the idea of governance and how you manage design, but I think it's actually super relevant instead. And I don't know what the requirements will be, but what I can say is that I think it really brings up this idea of how of governance around design, because I mean, now we're going to be in a situation where we can just kind of go back to the office en masse. Like it's going to be like a selective, it's going to be selective the way we go back, right? So some teams, certain teams can go, there's going to be rotation. And so I think this then links back to the idea of like, why do we need the office space, or why do we need meeting areas and collaborative areas? And this links back to the idea of like, how do we work? How do we collaborate? Which links back to the idea of how you manage all this, right? And so like basically kind of then, like coming back to the office should become like a part of the governance around your design operations. And it's gonna be different company to company, but I hope that this is like a additional push to really kind of have this moment of reflection and this kind of like step from thinking about a lot about methodology in design to think about governance in design as well. Cool. Moment of silence. I think this is good.
Any other questions before we head off? Was this was this interesting for everyone? Like if you can give us a bit of feedback on how it was. Cool. It's hard to get a tell on Zoom how people.
Okay, cool.
Barry is quite expressive, so I can see when he's like feeling something. So it's good. Even you, Tamar, you're very expressive, so I can feel when you're feeling something. So I was like leveraging YouTube, and I'm like, how's everyone? Yeah, Emily.
It made me think about my own organization, but also the organizational structure of my client and how as a service provider we're hitting up against that. So like all these things are kind of pinging around in my head. It was really interesting.
Cool.
That's something that we can't open up as a topic, but I think you made me think about the fact that actually even as a big organization, then you have partners, you have clients, and then the idea of like governance versus other governances and how do they work together. This can lead to kind of a better way to work with your clients. But yeah, this is great. So I also want to say, like, we were just kind of, we knew that this talk was really open and it was really a discussion, and I'm really glad that people enjoyed that and didn't find it too crazy. We probably got more from you that we gave you, but hopefully that's opened up some new kind of way of looking at design. I think also maybe most of the things that we said might already be around in the infosphere with under different names, but we're just trying to kind of I guess frame them in a way that gonna be usable for the community. Cool.
So we're at 8.
Natalie, you will say goodbye.
Bye. No, thank you everyone. Well, no, I just want to say thanks for everyone joining and the passion for staying. Clearly they were interested. They stayed a half hour past when we said we would. So great engagement, everyone. Thank you so much. Nothing else to add. Kathleen, anything?
No,
just
nothing. Just one thing. We're going to send out a call for a speaker and organizer later. So if you guys are interested in submitting a speaker organizer, you could be the person or you could recommend someone else. That's the thing I want to say.
And Jen, you just asked me if I don't know the answer to this, but you can reach us offline and we can talk about design in Europe and US. But I just want to say that I don't think the US is behind. I think things are very different, and obviously I'm never going to say that US is going to catch up with Europe because we are from Europe, but this is just a joke. But it's a very interesting conversation. Please reach us on email or wherever. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.